So in the 18th century, and mostly focused on England, although we'll talk a little bit about it in Germany as well, we see a continuing evolution. Like I had talked about with the Baroque in England in the late 16 and early 1700s, the English didn't get quite as elaborate and over the top ornamented and decorated as we saw with the Italian and French Baroque, or yeah, the Italian and French Baroque, and really kind of abandoned it early on after really only about 50 years or so, and began to transition to what we would call a Neo-Palladian or Neoclassical architectural style. Again, its fundamental roots are with the Renaissance, and the Renaissance, of course, tying back to, the Roman and to some extent Greek, but also Roman antiquity in the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. And they especially continued their fixation and fascination and inspiration on Palladio, and that's why sometimes it's called Neo-Palladian architecture, although more typically we would call it neoclassical. So, and this is also a period, the 1700s is a period in which we began to see massive changes in the world. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which we'll be talking about in a few lectures from now after colonial architecture, that transforms architecture and society quite radically. We see the origins of that in the 1700s. We also, this is the era of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is basically a blossoming of knowledge and science and understanding of our natural world and our scientific world. And that, of course, the things that we learn out of the Enlightenment about science and technology will be then adapted and used during the Industrial Revolution, to build new materials and new architecture. And so, but it still has one foot in the old world, the ancient. There's continues to be a real fixation with the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome, and even a more scientific study of it. Brunelleschi, we talked about that way back at the beginning, how he went to Rome and he's, drawing and sketching and learning about the Roman ruins there, and it helped to, foment the Renaissance and the sort of fascination with ancient Rome. We even see a more scientific study by archaeologists who began to do excavations, and they do measured drawings and do it in a way that even today, archaeology is more of a science, and really studying accurately, and that some of that knowledge of their explorations and discoveries in Greece and in old Turkey and in Egypt helped to continue this fixation on the ancient world. So like I said, this is an era that still continues the fascination with Palladio. So we're not done with him, and we're even going to come back to Palladio a few more times this semester. He, like I said, way back when we first started talking about him, he's one of the most important architects in world history, and then certainly his influence continues on. And of course, most of you identified this properly in your quiz, the Villa Rotunda. A few of you spelled it wrong, but at least you recognized it. So good. So let's start with what would hopefully be a very obvious link to that Villa Rotunda and to Palladio, and that's Chiswick House in London. This is from 1725, finished in 29. The architect was the owner, Richard Boyle, also known as Lord Burlington, and the professional architect, William Kent. So here is Richard Boyle, known as the Earl of Burlington or Lord Burlington, and he was, a nobleman, House of Lords, but he fancied himself an architect, what we might call a gentleman architect in this era. And what that meant is that this was not his profession. As a wealthy nobleman, he did not work for a living. That would have been beneath him, and didn't need to. He had plenty of money on his own through his inheritance, and the people living on his land paying him rent and so forth. But he had plenty of spare time, and he was interested in architecture, and so he studied it and was able to buy Palladio's 4 books on architecture, and probably Alberti's books and other books that were being published by this time. And so he fancied himself an architect and essentially designed his house. Now, he hired a professional architect, William Kent. This was, in fact, life, this was his living and his career. And so he was a little more formally trained and had some, ability to kind of help Lord Burlington, work out the details almost. But the essential design inspiration was by Richard Boyle. And here's the view of it. So if this looks like, hopefully this looks like the Villa Rotunda to you. If I've done my job, you would say, oh my God, that looks just like Villa Rotunda. So we see a temple front, we see a square, pointer, we see a square, it looks like a square house, it is. We see a temple front on the face, and we see a dome. Essentially, although it's a octagonal drum, it's essentially a Pantheon-style Roman dome that we see there. And in fact, on the backside, now unlike Villa Rotunda, it doesn't have the temple front on all 4 sides. So here's the backside of it. But instead of a temple front, we see, remember what these windows are? Most of you got that right. Actually, I think all of you got that right on the quiz. The Palladian window. So there's 3 of them here. So another direct tie-in to Palladio here. And in fact, if we look at the plan of Chiswick House on the right, and we compare that to the plan and section of Villa Rotunda, we in fact have almost, it's not a copy, it's an inspiration. So we have a octagonal salon here at the center instead of a circular, and we saw that expressed in the octagon drum of the exterior. But it's basically a party house with rooms that go around it, and just one temple front on the front side. Here's a section rendering through the dome room. Pretty elaborate and extensive. We've got the coffering, just like we would see in the coffering of the Pantheon dome. There's a view of it as it was built. So very much in the style and inspiration of Palladio. Here's one of the other rooms in the space. We see this little half-domed niche off to the side. And again, based on a Renaissance neoclassical foundation here, but really more inspired by the work of Palladio. But this is coming, a century after, the English Renaissance, and that's part of why we would call this neoclassical or neo-Palladian, because this is in this generation, in the mid 1700s, they're saying, hey, we really like that architecture that was done, 100, 150 years ago in England, and the architecture that was done even earlier than that in northern Italy by Palladio. Let's build that. Let that the architecture of today. So there's been a long disassociation of time, and that they're coming back to this. They're coming back to something that is more pure Palladio as part of their inspiration. But one of the things, and we see this at Chiswick House, one of the differences or evolutions that's going to occur in England is in landscape and garden design. When we talked about Renaissance and even in the Baroque, the garden designs that we saw at Versailles and at the Villa d'Este in Tivoli, those were very formal gardens. They had a strong axis, they had cross axes, and they had strong symmetry of the different garden elements throughout. But at Chiswick House, and you can see that a little bit here in the aerial view, but even more so, get to it in the plan, the gardens begin a tradition by the English to become more picturesque. So in this plan here, we see the house is up here. Can you kind of see it here where my pointer is towards the right? And we see a formal allée or garden behind that. And we see this strong line here, but it's not an axial element because on either side of it is not symmetrical. We see in the sections that are divided, we see a more randomness, and that is what the English called picturesque. And this is the beginning of a tradition in English landscape design that will carry on in throughout the world to create something that is maybe more appropriate or more reflective of the natural environment, which is not formal and organized and symmetrical. It's a little more random. Interestingly, within some of these elements might be strong formality. We see that in this upper portion here, and we do see these very straight linear allées that lead from one point to another, which is an element of Baroque landscape and urban planning. So it's a mix, and that's often what happens early in a trend where you see a little bit of the old style and new elements being introduced, and we see that a lot here at Chiswick House at the Gardens. So here's a view of that kind of open lawn that is more formal, but yet there's also this little element here where we have a rustic looking stone bridge with a waterfall flowing on one side and under the bridge, and another little waterfall underneath that. That's much more what we call picturesque. It looks like something you might come upon in nature or in some medieval landscape of this rough stone bridge. But we mix that with an image like this, which is quite a formal garden in the sense of Renaissance, where it has some strong axis and lots of symmetry, but it has this meadow with a little tempietto installed on it and an Egyptian obelisk sitting in the reflecting pool. So this is common in English gardening here, where we create these little vignettes where you want meander, in this natural landscape that we just saw, and then all of a sudden you come upon this clearing with a little tempietto in it, and it's definitely modeled on the Pantheon in Rome. It's got a little temple front, and then it's got the dome, the spherical dome that we saw at the Pantheon. So this is the traditions of the 18th century, the mid 1700s, that become quite common in England and then will spread out. One of the central points for this neoclassical tradition is in Bath, England. Bath is a town to the west of London, and go to the next slide, was literally a bath. It was a Roman bath back when the Romans occupied English territory starting in AD or CE 70 up through about 300, when they were finally forced out. There was a natural sulfuric water here, and the Romans thought that it had medicinal properties. It smells like rotten eggs because it's sulfuric, and you can drink it. I have tasted it. It is nasty. It's like drinking rotten eggs. But it was thought that it had medicinal properties, maybe because it smelled so bad, it made you forget about whatever ailment you had. I'm not sure. But the Romans had turned this into a bath, and in the 1700s, the English elite, the wealthy English, said, "Hey, maybe this could cure our ails too." And so they kind of started coming here, and they rebuilt the ruins, the Roman ruins of the bath, into something. This is more neoclassical on top, but these are actual Roman ruins down here at the bottom, and came here for their health, and it was basically a getaway. It was a place to come and hang out in a rural town with good food and friends and stuff. The same reason that people go to Galena nowadays, or go to the Michigan shoreline as a getaway from the city. And because of that, there was quite an opportunity for architects to build new buildings to house the wealthy people coming to visit here. And John Wood, the elder, seen here, took great advantage of that and was an immensely talented architect and began a neoclassical tradition here in Bath. So there are two projects that he started the circus, which is the round, the fully circular element that we see on the right, and then his son John Wood the Younger. You know, you got the elder, you got the younger. Easy to remember, I guess. He completed what's known as the Crescent on the left over here a few years later. And I always kind of have to think that maybe they were inspired by Stonehenge. If you remember from the fall semester, one of the first things we talked about was the circular stones of Stonehenge. This is just a few miles outside of Bath, and certainly, you know, the people visiting Bath would have been familiar with Stonehenge. They might have made a little excursion out here during their visits to Bath, and certainly would have been familiar with the fact that this was a circular set of stones. And would that have inspired John Wood the Elder to create a housing development in the round? You know, perhaps there's some tie-in. Certainly, this was a planning element that we were seeing in Italy and in France, even a little bit in England. But he takes it to, you know, this next level, creating this full circular plaza surrounded by a curved building. Now it's a very Renaissance facade, actually. It's got the tripartite design that we talked about. On the ground is the Doric, and then we've got the Ionic on the second level and the Corinthian on the third level. And if I show you a detail, we can see that pretty clearly. So here's the ground level with Doric order, and it even includes the triglyphs and metopes in the entablature. There's the Ionic. Can't see it, it's cut off, but the Corinthian order is on the upper level. But one of the things that make this neoclassical is look at the detail of the Doric entablature with the triglyphs and metopes, and you'll notice that this is not Greek or Roman symbols. These are, these are symbols of the era. And this is partly what makes this neoclassical. It has this classical element, but it begins to introduce something that is contemporary. These little images here, especially the tool, geez, I can't think of the name, this geometric tool here and these other elements of science and technology of the era is something that represents the 18th century. And then just down the road from 1767 to 1774, his son, John Wood the Younger, builds the Royal Crescent. This is clearly based on the circus, the full circular design, but it's only half a circus, so it is a crescent. Just like you have a full moon, that's a full round, or you have a crescent moon, which is just an arc. So here we just have an arc, and they called it the Royal Crescent. It is a great aerial view here, and you can see what this provides is a set of townhomes in which everybody has a view, and they all essentially have an equal view. So if this were just a straight row, like we see in some of the developments beyond that, their view is, just across the street. But with this, they have a gracefully curving lawn, and everybody has an axial view, right, off the center point of the lawn. And that, is a selling point to wealthy visitors who, want a townhome to come visit on weekends or in the summers. And, you can sell them on the idea that, hey, you've got a broad vista outside of your windows and not just, a development that's going to be across the street from you. And we can see that nicely. This is my photo from my visit in 2009. What an extensive vista everybody in this development gets, even more so than in the circus development by his father. Ultimately they're still seeing the buildings on the opposite side of the circus. Here, because they're in only a half crescent, they get a wide vista with, open landscape beyond them. And here's a detail. He changes up the facade a little bit. We don't have the tripartite design of his father's development at the circus. We have just a single colonnade of Ionic order here to kind of create a very nicely scaled and proportioned facade. Here's a detail of that. You can even just make out, because these are privately owned even today, you can make out the differences where somebody has cleaned their facade and where somebody hasn't. These were all individual townhomes for wealthy families, and these were vacation houses for them, not full-time houses in most cases. And here's a rendering from 1820 of the Crescent. As one would approach down the street, you would see a little bit of the curvature. And this would be a great place, if you're wealthy in this era, you would take strolls in the late afternoon, hand in hand with your sweetheart or with your lady friends, and you would see other wealthy people and you would chit chat and so forth. And men would ride, horses with their top hats and, their formal tuxedos and all that. And this was the socialization process that occurred in this era, and this grand arc, let me go back to this image here, was the way to do that, and you had a nice way of strolling around the arc, or even along the lawn. You could picnic on the lawn and that sort of thing. These were all social entertainment things that the wealthy owners would have done in this era. Also in Bath is a development by Robert Adam from 1770, finished in 1774, and it's known as the Pultany Bridge. This is literally a bridge. Here's, let me start first with an image of Adam looking kind of like some of our founding fathers, right? George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. He's got his powdered wig on, that sort of thing. And in fact, many early colonial architecture in America is known sometimes as Adamesque because of the influence of this gentleman here, Robert Adam, an English architect, but because you look at the dates, this is also during the American colonial period, and he was very influential to the architecture of the English colonies at this time. And Adam would have been a trained architect. He would have, after his training, he and his brother took what was known as a grand tour. It was a traveling. It was sort of the equivalent of a study abroad. Now we do it, as part of our curriculum. I studied abroad for a year in Versailles, and it was an incredible experience. I got to travel across Europe and see the architecture of Europe, both ancient, and modern. And Adam was able to do this in the 1750s, studying classical Roman and Greek architecture. He might have traveled to Greece and Turkey to see those ruins. He might have gone to Egypt and seen the ancient Egyptian ruins. And they would take notes, draw sketches, and bring that info back, and they would use that as inspiration then throughout their career. And Adam was able to do this, and was one of the reasons why he was such a prolific and important architect. This is a rendering of the Pultany Bridge, one of his early works. And rather than just a bridge that people and carriages could cross over the river, he decided to make this a work of architecture. And so he comes up with the idea of, let's put a building on the sides of the bridge. There's still a roadway in the center, but on either side would be shops. And this becomes just an extension of the commercial street in Bath, and as you cross the bridge, you can go in and out of shops. It's a pretty rare thing. There's one in Florence that dated earlier. He probably would have seen that and maybe was inspired by it, that crosses the river Arno, and he creates that here in Bath. It's a very Neo-Palladian. In fact, right here at the center with a little temple element is a Palladian window. And so that's partly what makes this, what was the name of the Bridge Palace? Which one are you talking about? Oh, the Chateau Chenonceau. Is that the one you were talking about in France, where they built the with they built the chateau house palace over the river. So yeah, there's another example. Now, in that case, it wasn't a bridge, but it was just a house sitting over the river. But here we see a similar thing, except it also, as we'll see in this image, functions as a roadway. And even today, you can drive across this bridge. You have to make sure you're driving on the opposite side, like the English do. But there are also little shops, along here that you can go in and out. It's a very quaint little thing here. Another example by Robert Adam is Paxton House from 1774, finished in 91. This is also important because Thomas Chippendale did the interior decorating. I don't know if some of you may have heard of like Chippendale furniture or the Chippendale style. He was a very famous English interior designer and furniture designer. And, if you watch like Antiques Roadshow sometimes, they'll say, oh, this is a Chippendale. Well, that's what they're talking about. And he was influential to furniture makers in the English colonies as well. And that's why sometimes they'll say, oh, this is, from colonial Boston or Philadelphia, and it's a Chippendale style. Well, that's what they're talking about. So here is Paxton House. And again, very Neo-Palladian. A temple front right on the front here in the Doric order with triglyphs and metopes, and a simple square plan here. Very similar to the early English Renaissance and obviously similar to the Palladian architecture we saw in the Renaissance here. But hundreds of years later, not 1500s, it's the 1770s. So that's, it's a rebirth of the earlier Renaissance Palladian architecture. And that's why we call it Neo-Palladian or Neoclassical. Here's the interior designed by Chippendale. And another room by Chippendale. Give you a sense. So here's one of the tables. This is a table designed for Paxton House. And this is classic Chippendale style. Now we're going to talk a little more about Neoclassicism, and so this is the origins of it, and it really has a stronger association with Renaissance and Palladio. But no, we're going to start to see an evolution of this into something that isn't anything quite like the Renaissance. And we'll start with Sir John Sohn and his own house from 1812 to 1837. So this is just a little late in this 19th or 18th century period. Sohn was a talented architect. Here is an image of him. Not wearing a fancy powdered wig, actually. He looks a little more normal to us, I think. Calipers, this is what I was trying to think of. These are known as calipers. He's holding those, an important tool for an architect. So he was quite famous as an architect. This is an image or rendering of his Royal Bank of England from 1788. It no longer exists, or at least not in this form, but here's a rendering of it. It's neoclassical. It has, a colonnade along here, but with a sort of wing on top that's somewhat neoclassical as well. But I want to really highlight his own house. On the left is a rendering. On the right is how it looks today. He lived here for, much of his life and career from 1812 to 1837. And so he was constantly fidgeting with it and making improvements and adding on to it. And so, it evolved over time. But you can see that even though there's originally there was a sort of open loggia, this is not a loggia of a pure classical Roman or Greek front. It's really sort of stylized. Almost geometric designs to it that are not like anything we would have seen in with the classical orders. And that's partly what makes this neoclassical, is it's taking this basic classical form and beginning to mold it and change it into something completely different. Sohn was a collector. He would have done a grand tour as well, and as he traveled around, he collected, artifacts, plaster casts of famous sculptures and all that, and he collected them in his own house. This is, if you take a tour, if you go to London, take a tour of the Sohn house. You will not be disappointed. It is quite an extravagant thing to go visit, and it's exactly left like he left it when he died. And so it's a pretty amazing place to visit through his collection and to see this cornucopia of architectural elements and sculptures that he collected throughout his life. This is what he called the picture room. He hung all kinds of paintings in here, and he had so many paintings that he created these panels on the walls that could be opened up, and on the backside would be more paintings. And the English call them pictures. Nowadays photographs or pictures, but paintings back in those days were called pictures. And then if you open up another panel, there's a view, a little vista to another room with a sculpture in it. It's to stand in this room and have this curator begin to open these panels up, and you see, oh my God, there's another thing behind it. Oh my God, there's another thing behind that. It's just like one thing after another. It's like a fun house for neoclassical architecture. Here's a section, and it's really hard to portray in photographs and images. This house is very three-dimensional all around. Everywhere you look, there is a different view and vista and domed and vault and space. I encourage you, we really don't have time, but I encourage you to click on the link that's shown here, and it's in the Blackboard under the course materials, and you can watch a 5 or 6 minute video, essentially a tour of the house. It's well worth it, and like I say, go to London and visit this house. It's really well worth it. I want to talk about the Royal Salt Works at Chaux. This is in France, so this tradition of neoclassicism crosses the channel into France, and Claude Nicolas Ledoux is one of the preeminent architects in this style. This is the salt works from 1775, finished in 1779. Here's an image of Ledoux with his daughter. Here he's got the powdered wig on. And this is one of those. I was talking about how the origins of the Industrial Revolution start in the 1700s, and this is one of those. This was a salt production facility. There would have been salt mines in the region, and as they bring it out of the mines, they collect it and they process it here. Not quite a full industrial facility of the 19th and 20th century that we might imagine, but still an industrial facility. And Ledoux and his client were like, well, we have all of these workers. Let's provide housing for them, and let's do so in a nice way. Let's not have tenement housing. We could provide nicely done homes for our workers, and provide them with even some garden plots where they can grow their own vegetables and lead a decent life. It was a kind of enlightened view, part of the Enlightenment, literally, enlightened view of maybe how better to treat workers rather than just forcing them to survive on sub-living wages in tenements that are overcrowded and disease-ridden. And so Ledoux designs this layout that essentially is a square with an open lawn in front. And the main buildings would have been along here on the top for the salt processing, and then along the bottom here would have been houses and apartments for the workers. And you can see garden plots off to the side, and even some formal gardens for them to enjoy fresh air, some fresh vegetables, and so forth. This would have been a very delightful thing. Then they kind of replans it more on this curved form, and so the main buildings now are at the center of the curve right here, and then the housing would have been in this arc across here, and you can see out back, each person would have had a little garden plot out back there. Even that didn't get fully built. Here's a rendering view of what it might have looked like had it been fully realized. It never got fully built, but the main director's house and the salt processing buildings were fully built. And hopefully you can see this is what makes this neoclassical, is look at the temple front on here. Now this has almost a Neo-Palladian design, right? It's a square building. It has a temple front sticking off the side. It doesn't have a dome, but it has this big, a little lantern almost sitting on the top of the roof. And I'll show you this image here, it's more clear. Look at the columns of this building. it's a Doric order, and it even has triglyphs and metopes, but these are not column shafts that would have ever been in ancient Greece. Look at the squares that are mixed in with the round drums. That is something completely 19th or 18th century. Nothing like this would have ever been built by the ancient Greeks or Romans, and that's what makes this distinctly neoclassical, because it has a foundation or a reference or an inspiration by classical or by Palladian architecture, but it's completely changed in its detailing. This is cute. I'm going to go over just a little bit to try to wrap up some of the 18th century. But this is another project by Ledoux, never built, but it's an idea of creating a house for someone. This would have been on a river, and they used the river flowing of waters for for their early industry, the water wheels, to power up grist mills like that. And so this would have been a house of someone overseeing the river flow, and he envisions the river flowing through the house. Now, jumping ahead a little bit, what house are we going to be talking about later in the semester by a famous architect where the river flows through the house? Anyone want to cash a guess? Falling Water, yes. I'm not suggesting that Frank Lloyd Wright was inspired by Ledoux from the 1700s for Falling Water, but the idea for a house with a river literally running through it is, already thought about in 1775 by Claude Ledoux. I want to show you just another example. This is by the architect Etienne Louis Boulay. And it's again, something that was completely impractical to build. It was a monument to Sir Isaac Newton. This is pure Enlightenment here. Isaac Newton was seen as this hero of the Enlightenment, discovers all these different things about nature and science, and the idea of gravity is understood by Newton. And so Boulay thinks, let's just create a monument to this guy. He was so incredible. And he envisions a 500-foot diameter dome, spherical dome, that would have a sort of a sculptural element in the middle of this thing, 500 feet in diameter. Remember, the dome of the Pantheon, the dome of Florence Cathedral, was about 145 feet in diameter. This is 500 foot in diameter. So there was no way they could have built this thing. And here's a detailed view. To the scale, these little images down on the bottom, these are people. That's how massive this thing would have been. They had no way to build this. This was just fanciful creations of imagination. But it really begins to represent this Enlightenment ideal of, we could build something bigger. We could build something grander. And they didn't have the technologies to do it yet. But, when we start talking about the 19th century architecture, they're going to have that technology, and we're going to see bigger and grander and more massive. And I'll end here with Ledoux and his toll gates for Paris in the 1780s. Paris was expanding. It was getting bigger and bigger, and this graphic shows you the evolution of the walls that surrounded the city. Early on, the medieval walls protected the city from foreign invaders, but by the 1780s, the walls were more about, limiting people from coming in without paying taxes. The farmers would come in to sell their goods at market. They needed to pay a tax in order to do that. And so they set up these walls, would have toll booths at the entrances, and you had to pay a toll to enter the city with goods. And Ledoux was hired to create the little toll booths, just like on the, on the express or on the tollways. That now we have open road tolling, but back before we had that, there were these toll plazas, and you had to stop and you had to pay your toll to go on the highway. Just the same thing here. And so Ledoux envisions different designs for the different toll booths at the city gates. And some of these look a lot like the salt works. The one down here at the bottom has the same sort of colonnade. And even this one, especially sort of near the bottom left, has that distinctive drum with the circular and the square elements on these column shafts. We have something up in the upper left that looks a lot like a Palladian villa, almost the Villa Rotunda. But then look at the one in the middle top. It has a neoclassical temple front, but a massive drum sitting on top here. And in fact, that one still survives, and it's at the Place de Stalingrad. And it's this sort of neoclassical temple front with this massive drum, far bigger than any drum or dome that would have been built. And it doesn't even have a dome on it. It looks like it ought to be the drum of a dome, of a Renaissance dome, but it doesn't. So this is neoclassical. It's taking something, it's exaggerating the scale. It's proportionally not accurate. This massive drum sitting on this temple front doesn't go together, and it really ought to have a dome on it, but it doesn't. These are all classical features or fundamental features of what we would call neoclassical. All right, I will stop here and we'll just finish up briefly with some examples of neoclassical by Carl Friedrich Schinkel in Berlin next time.